Merry Christmas. Yeah. This time of year, every year, you're likely, if you go to Hy-Vee or someplace that has a magazine rack of the most popular magazines, you're likely to see a cover of one of the secular magazines that has Jesus on it. Well, a picture of what they think, traditionally Jesus looked like, and they're always almost all wrong. National Geographic gets pretty close. But you're likely to see it. For example, this Easter, whether it's Easter or Christmas, you're likely to see it. This Easter, 2024, Life magazine. Life magazine used to be a big deal when I was a kid. I still think they do something a little bit. Apparently this is an issue they did. But this is Easter. Jesus, how his lessons, miracles, and devotion changed the world. Pretty bold title for Life magazine. National Geographic, An Illustrated Life. Jesus, An Illustrated Life. I'd like to see that. But usually they have articles that are pretty good. Sometimes, they're written by people who aren't believers, which is always strange to me. But they're usually, sometimes have good information in them. The reason they do it is not because these magazines are trying to promote Jesus in any kind of way. The reason they do it is because, according to the publishing industry, that if you have a picture of Jesus on your cover, that's going to increase sales by 45%. If you have the Bible or something about the Bible on your cover, that's going to increase sales by 51%. So this Christmas, Time magazine, this is their cover. Jesus, who he was, who he is, his miracles, his mission, his love. And every year there's this kind of magazine, this kind of cover story on these magazines, and they're basically always asking the same questions. What do you do with Jesus? How do you explain the Jesus phenomenon? I can tell you right now, he didn't look like that, but how do you explain the Jesus phenomenon? What happened 2,000 years ago? Something big happened 2,000 years ago that changed the world in significant ways, so much so that secular magazines are compelled to have Jesus on their cover. Something happened, and the Jesus story is not going to die. The Wall Street Journal beginning this month, did an article on the booming increase. The sales of Bibles are booming, fueled by first-time buyers and new versions. And in the story, you read it, you find out that the print books, just books in general, the publishing industry, print books have increased this year by less than 1% in sales. So this year compared to this time last year, print books in general have increased less than 1%, but Bibles have increased 22% versus this time last year. This time last year, the sale of Bibles was 14.2 copies sold. Compared to 2019, that was 9.7 copies sold. That's still a lot, but you can see between 2019 and last year at this time, 2023, there's been a huge increase. 5 million copies more were sold last year. And this year is on pace to sell even more. And the article talks about how these Bible purchases are being surged by college students and Gen Z in general. The Jesus story won't die. 2,000 years later, well, you can look at any article that has anything, you can see right here how many years later, roughly. A little over 2,000 years later, something happened. There it says 2024. Something happened. Something big happened. But what really was it? Who was Jesus? And what do you do with Jesus? And how do you explain Jesus? And what's your explanation for what happened that just exploded onto the scene in world history? Well, it turns out timing is everything. That if you're going to have a movement that's about 100 or so people become the most multi-ethnic movement in human history, the entire globe, the timing is the thing. It has to be perfect timing. And that's what exactly it was with the message of Jesus. The Apostle Paul writes it this way. In 48 AD, he wrote a letter to believers in a region called Galatia, part of the Roman Empire. And he said this, he said, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman. It's almost as if there was this plan of God all along. When the set time had fully come, that's when Jesus was born. As if God had this window he was preparing in human history, world history, that was just the right window for him to become human in the person of Jesus and to raise up disciples, and that those disciples would begin to share the message of his resurrection, the message of his miracles, his teachings, and all that, and that would eventually become a global movement that is, as I said, the most multi-ethnic movement in world history. It's as if God was orchestrating the perfect window in time for that to happen. There's a couple of things I think that are good examples of God doing exactly that. One is Alexander the Great. 300 years before Jesus was born, Alexander the Great was a conqueror, and he took over his dad's army after his dad died, and took that army and conquered the rest of Greece, and then conquered Europe east of Greece, conquered northern Africa, conquered the Middle East, conquered all the way to India. He died in 323 BC. He was 32 years old. He did all that before he was 32 years old. How you doing with your age? How old are you? What have you done? But he did all that. But here's the thing about Alexander the Great. He's not a good guy. I mean, as far as conquerors go, he was probably one of the better guys. But, you know, he was incredibly proud and violent and cruel and responsible for the death of thousands. And the oppression even of more than that. But there was a part of him that also wanted to do good in the world that he conquered. He was tutored by Aristotle. Aristotle, if you take any class on anything, the first week is going to be on Aristotle, whatever Aristotle said about that subject. He was the Greek philosopher, the polymath who knew whatever there is to know in the 300s BC. Aristotle knew it and taught it, and he was Alexander the Great's tutor from childhood, and he was his influence all the way through his life. Aristotle died a year after Alexander the Great died. And one of the things that Alexander the Great learned from Aristotle was the love of Greek literature, the love of Greek knowledge. And so what Alexander the Great did as he conquered, he brought tutors with him. All these tutors that he had come and teach the leaders of the places that he conquered Greek literature, the Greek language, and other things as well. And so much so that in this is a picture here of after Alexander the Great died, 4 of his generals took over his kingdom. But this was Alexander the Great's kingdom, from Greece all the way up here into parts of Europe, and then what's modern day Turkey, and then the Middle East, and then all the way to India and northern Africa, all the way down to Sudan. That's Alexander the Great personally there, usually led the charge and conquered all these areas. When his 4 generals took over, it became a Greek empire for 2 centuries. And they continued to teach the Greek language until all these people groups here, all these people spoke Greek as a second language. Now, if you're God and you're trying to prepare a window in time that'd be the perfect time for Jesus to be born and that message to spread, and you were going to write scripture, you were going to write a New Testament that would teach what Jesus did and what he taught, and would teach about the gospel, teach the teachings of Christianity, you couldn't find a better language to use than ancient Greek. It was a ready-made language of philosophy because the Greeks have been doing philosophy for hundreds of years. It was the ready-made language even of theology because they've been doing theology as well. Some of the more ancient theological classics are Greek before Christianity. But they still had the language for it. But the thing also about Greek is that it is so precise that every single Greek word is spelled a certain way based on how it functions grammatically in a sentence and what other words in that sentence it modifies. So if you want precision, you can't find a better language than ancient Greek. And so here's what happened is that after a couple centuries of the Greek Empire, eventually in the 1st century BC, the Roman Empire arose. And the Roman Empire conquered all the Alexander the Great Empire, and even more so in northern Africa. And then here, west of Rome and all that, Spain, Britain, all this became part of the Roman Empire for centuries. And the thing about the Romans is they decided everybody already knows Greek, So we're not going to make Latin the official, I mean, it's official language maybe of emperors, but we're going to have Greek be the language of commerce. And so they spread the Greek language even more in northern Africa, all of Europe, up to Britain. This entire region here spoke and read and could write, if you were literate enough to write and read Greek. So that when Jesus died and rose again from the dead and his disciples were spreading the message of his resurrection, they were able to, wherever they went in the Roman Empire, they could speak the language that everybody understood. And they could have, when they wrote letters to different churches, that became part of the New Testament, but they could write in the same language everywhere. That's why the New Testament's written in ancient Greek. And there's something about the 2 centuries there, like a generation before Jesus was born all the way till almost the end of the 100s AD, that 200 years was a time of incredible peace throughout the Roman Empire. It was a peace through violence. I'm not saying it was good, but there was something about that peace that God still used, just like he could still use a conqueror like Alexander the Great. God used it so that the Christian disciples could travel freely throughout the Roman Empire. And they could travel not just by boat, but they could travel by road. Here's a map here of the Roman roads. You've heard about the Roman roads. The Romans laid 63,000 miles of pavement road. They weren't dusty roads that made paths in the dirt. These were roads that were often 3 or 5 feet deep of gravel, sand, rock, and then eventually a layer of flat rocks on top. They've lasted till this day throughout Europe, many of them have. And these roads were built so that the Roman soldiers had the vast armies that could spread fast to any part of the Roman Empire that they needed to go. That wasn't a great thing if you were being oppressed by Roman soldiers. And they did crucify Jesus. But God still used what they did to cause the gospel to spread very fast, so that all along these Roman roads, the disciples planted churches, and those churches became centers of Christianity for centuries. And a lot of them were the churches that they wrote to that comprise the names of the books in our New Testament. See, the thing is that they were roads built so well that even to this day throughout Europe, you can see at different places where it hasn't been buried by the dirts of time, you can see Roman roads, and you can see they were 15 to 30 miles wide. And they still last to this day as a legit road that you can drive your car down. That's why Christianity eventually became the most multi-ethnic movement in human history. And one argument could be, gosh, Christianity sure was incredibly lucky. I mean, if you're going to have a movement start and go global, it's really lucky that it happened exactly where it happened, that this story of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, that just happened at just the right time so that apostles so dedicated to spreading the message of Jesus' resurrection, and they died doing it, they wouldn't stop doing it till eventually they were executed by Nero, in many of them, like Paul and Peter, executed by the Emperor Nero in the 60s AD. But they wouldn't stop doing it because they were witnesses of it. But how lucky is it that at just the right time, that time that happened was the window in history where it could spread so fast? It could be luck. I mean, you could make that argument. Or it could be what the Apostle Paul wrote. But when the set time had fully come, well, that's when it was just prepared by God, just right, perfectly, by God being sovereign and providential in history, even the bad things, the bad people, that's when God sent his son, born of a woman. And this birth and the miracles and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, it shows that this idea of his son, that this language in the Bible, this language, it doesn't mean like we use it today, I'm a child of God. Yes, that's true. But when the Bible talks about the son, singular, of God, it's talking about the human embodiment of God himself. We said that word, the incarnation, we said it earlier, Scott said it. It's the infleshing, God becoming human, which that shows you that God is all in. It shows you that God is real. If you're ever wondering, is God real? Well, what are you going to do with Jesus? Is the question you have to answer. What is it about Jesus that changed the world in so many ways? Doesn't mean his followers are perfect, they are not. But something about his teachings when I read them, something about his miracles, something about this death and resurrection and the message of the apostles, and they wouldn't stop proclaiming it to their own death. Well, it shows you that God is real and that the whole Bible is one epic story from beginning to end, ultimately about him. This story that begins, that says that God created human beings in his own image, it says, to live people who could represent God, to live in the love of God and represent his love, to live in the glory of God and represent his glory to all creation. And so that was God's desire for humanity. So he built a place called Eden. It was a garden. And it had water coming from this throne of God, this presence of God type, and it gave water to all the garden so that there was green lush all everywhere. And there was, well, what it says in the second page of the Bible, every tree that is pleasing to the eye and good for food. And there was a tree of life that if humans ate from it, they would live forever. They wouldn't if they don't, but if they ate from that tree, they would live forever. But God took a man and a woman and he put them in this garden to flourish in it, to care for it, and eventually to spread Eden throughout the earth. See, the garden is just a place on the earth. It's not the whole earth, but they were told to spread Eden and to spread the lush, green life of walking and fellowship with God throughout the earth, to replace the thorns and thistles and dust and death outside with the Garden of Eden and the tree of life for humans to live forever. But the man and the woman, they just wanted to live for their own glory instead. And they wanted to decide what was good and bad for themselves. They didn't want to take God's word for it. So they turned away from God. And so God expelled them from Eden. He didn't want them to eat from the tree of life and live forever in their brokenness, so he expelled them, took Eden away, expelled them out into the thorns and thistles and dust and death and pain and confusion of the human condition, and it's remained that way ever since. And so the human condition now is filled with, well, the stories of the Roman Empire, the stories of Alexander the Great. The human condition is filled with violence and pride and greed and selfishness. Even at Christmas, maybe especially at Christmas. But God promised to become himself the Son of Man, to become the Son of God, the human embodiment of God. And that he would do miracles to show what real redemption and restoration looks like when God's in control of things and what Jesus is going to bring to this whole world. And he's going to bring to everybody who wants Jesus to be their king, wants to follow Jesus. He's taking their sin upon his body. He's taken death itself upon his body. And when he died in his body, he killed death and he killed sin forever. And when he rose from the dead, he was the first of a new humanity. And he was the first of a new creation that God is bringing to this world. It's already started with the resurrection of Jesus. It's already begun. And that's what he's doing for everybody who wants to follow him when he returns to bring resurrection like his to their own bodies on an earth that's resurrected as well. Now, I don't know what you do with that story. I don't know how you explain who was Jesus? Why did he change the world? What was it about him that people gave their lives proclaiming his resurrection? How do you explain what happened 2,000 years ago? I don't know what your explanation is. C.S. Lewis was a professor at Oxford in the early part of the 20th century, and he was an atheist who eventually became a Christian, wrote a book called Mere Christianity. It's really a good book if you haven't read it. He's got a little sentence in there that I thought was interesting for tonight. He says, "The Son of God became a man to enable men to become sons of God." Now, he's writing like an Englishman in the beginning of the 20th century. I think what we would say now is the Son of God became human so that humans can become children of God. I don't know if you see yourself in that story at all. Maybe the whole thing was luck. Maybe it was just all luck, and here we are talking about Jesus 2,000 years later because it just got lucky. But it's an unusual story just to get lucky. Miracles, a death that he surrendered to by the Romans, and a resurrection that his followers wouldn't stop proclaiming. I mean, even if there wasn't luck, that's an incredible message. How do you explain what happened? Well, I think the best explanation is the Bible's true, and that it is the one story. It is the one story that your life could be in. Maybe your life is in it right now. I don't know you. There's a lot of people in this room. I don't know what story you're coming in here with, what background, what beliefs, what's going on in your life. What are you going to do with Jesus? What are you going to do with that perfect window he was born in that has become this global movement, the most multi-ethnic movement in world history? I think the Bible's message is the explanation. God is all in on humanity. He's all in on this world, and he's all in on you. So Merry Christmas.